You step outside at noon, and the air hits you like a wall. Not warm, solid. Your eyes squint before you even decide to squint. The skin on the back of your neck starts prickling within 10 seconds. Somewhere behind your ribs, your heart quietly picks up its pace because your body has just realized it is under attack, and the attacker is the sun. Now take that feeling and stretch it across an entire civilization. No sunglasses, no air conditioning, no cold water from a tap. Just sand, stone, and a sun that in the deep Egyptian summer can push the air past 45 degrees Celsius, well over 110 Fahrenheit, with rock and sand surfaces baking even hotter than that. And somehow, in exactly that furnace, human beings didn't just survive. They built the pyramids. They ran an empire for 3,000 years. They invented eyeliner that fought bacteria, engineering that predicted air conditioning by 4,000 years, and a whole civil calendar built around when the water would come and when it wouldn't. Here's the part that should stop you. If even one link in that survival chain had failed, if the walls hadn't been thick enough, if the water routine had been wrong, if the eye infections that come free with desert dust had gone unchecked for a few generations, the Egypt you picture when you close your eyes wouldn't exist. No temples, no Nefertiti, no Great Pyramid quietly doing geometry homework at the edge of the desert for 4,500 years. You're not just watching a history lesson. You're watching the settings menu of your own species, dialed all the way up to hostile, and somehow still returning, survived. So here's the actual question, the one that never gets asked properly. How did people, with no modern technology at all, engineer their way through one of the most punishing climates on Earth, permanently, without ever managing to genetically become a different, heat-proof species? Because that's the twist nobody tells you. They didn't out-evolve the heat, they out-thought it. And the real answer is stranger, more layered, and considerably more clever than they just got used to it. That's the story people usually tell, by the way, so let's kill it first. The classic version goes like this. Ancient Egyptians lived next to a river in the desert for thousands of years, so naturally, over time, their bodies simply adapted. Thicker skin, better heat tolerance, maybe even physically different from people who evolved somewhere colder. It's a tidy story. It fits the they were basically superhuman myth that pyramids tend to invite. It is also, almost entirely, not how it happened. Here's the problem with the they just adapted story. Human beings, biologically, do not adapt to extreme heat nearly as fast, or as differently by region, as that myth implies. Take an ancient Egyptian farmer and a Scandinavian fisherman from the same era, strip away clothing, shelter, and culture, and their actual physiological hardware for handling heat is remarkably similar, which raises the obvious question. If their bodies weren't fundamentally different, what was? Here's the wild part. The real answer to how Egyptians survived the desert heat isn't one clever trick. It's a stack of them. Biological, architectural, chemical, and social, layered on top of each other so precisely that removing any single layer would have collapsed the whole system. And the deepest layer, the one that made every other layer possible, isn't Egyptian at all. It's older than Egypt. It's older than humans walking upright with clothes on. It's a piece of hardware built into you right now. Reading this, you sweat. That sounds almost insultingly obvious, but stay with it, because this is where it gets interesting. Humans are, without real competition, the best cooling mammal on the planet. Not the fastest, not the strongest, the best at dumping heat. According to research from evolutionary biologist Daniel Lieberman at Harvard, the human body carries something in the range of 2 to 4 million eccrine sweat glands spread across nearly the entire surface of the skin, a density unmatched by any other primate on Earth. A chimpanzee, our closest living relative, has a tiny fraction of that number, and most of its sweat glands aren't even the water-releasing kind. Ours almost all are. Here's the question nobody asks. Why would evolution bother building 2 to 4 million tiny water pumps into your skin? The answer, according to geneticist Yana Kambaroff and her research team, traces back to a single stretch of DNA, a genetic switch called an enhancer, sitting near a gene named engrailed 1. That, through a series of mutations deep in human evolutionary history, cranked up the production of exactly these glands. Every other ape kept the ancestral low-sweat setting. Humans, alone among primates, rewired themselves into what researchers have half-jokingly called the sweatiest ape. 2 million evaporative cooling units built in, running silently, for free, your entire life. And this is the part that connects straight back to Egypt, because sweating only works as a cooling system under one very specific condition: dry air. Sweat cools you by evaporating. Turning from liquid to vapor pulls heat directly off your skin. In a humid jungle, sweat just sits there, uselessly, because the air is already saturated with moisture and has nowhere to put yours. But in a hot, dry desert, precisely the kind of air that sits over the Nile Valley for most of the year, sweat evaporates fast and efficiently, pulling heat away at a rate almost no other cooling mechanism in the animal kingdom can match. In other words, the exact biology that makes humans miserable in a sauna makes us shockingly well suited to a desert. Egypt wasn't fighting against human biology. Egypt happened to sit on top of the one climate where human biology performs best. But, and here's where the debunk reveal cycle starts stacking, biology alone gets you nowhere without water to sweat with. A human being loses liters of fluid a day through sweat alone in extreme desert heat, and dehydration doesn't politely wait around. It kills within days, sometimes hours, in the worst conditions. So the sweating advantage is really a loan, not a gift, and the interest on that loan comes due immediately in the form of water you now desperately need to drink. Which brings us to the second layer, the one every schoolchild learns and almost nobody thinks hard enough about, the Nile. It's tempting to treat the Nile-provided water as the whole answer and move on. It isn't. According to Yale researchers Nadine Moeller and Joseph Manning, who study the interplay of climate and collapse in ancient Egypt, the Nile wasn't just a water source. It was a precision-timed agricultural machine, flooding on a predictable annual cycle that deposited fresh, fertile silt across the floodplain every single year. The Egyptians organized their entire calendar around it. Akhet, the flooding season; Peret, the growing season; Shemu, the harvest. Miss the flood, and you don't just go thirsty. The entire food supply for the year collapses with it. Moeller's research shows that when the Nile's flood pattern weakened for extended periods, even this famously resilient civilization strained near to breaking, with famine spreading and towns swelling as displaced people migrated in search of stability. The lesson buried in that data is almost uncomfortable. Egypt wasn't naturally immune to the desert. It was one bad flood cycle away from the same collapse that ended dozens of other river civilizations. Survival wasn't guaranteed, it was engineered, and it was fragile. Picture it directly for a second. It's the height of Akhet, the flood season, somewhere around 1400 BCE, on the floodplain outside a town not unlike Deir el-Medina. A woman kneels at the edge of newly retreating water, her forearms slick with cool mud up to the elbow, packing wet Nile silt into a wooden brick mold with the flat of her palm. The mud smells faintly mineral, almost metallic, mixed with the green rot of the receding flood. Straw, chopped short, is worked through the mixture to keep the bricks from cracking as they dry. She can feel the fibers catching against her palms with every fold. Overhead, the sun is already climbing hard by mid-morning and sweat runs freely down her spine, but here, ankle-deep in river mud, with wet clay cooling her hands, the heat is bearable in a way it won't be an hour from now, once she moves inland to the drying racks. She sets the finished brick in a long row beside 100 others, already pale and cracking at the edges in yesterday's sun, waiting to become someone's wall. She has no way of knowing that the bricks she is shaping right now will, in about 4,000 years, still be quietly performing their one job, keeping a family cool. Because here's the twist that most people get backward. They assume mud brick was Egypt's cheap, low-tech fallback, what you build with when you can't afford stone. According to research on ancient building science, mud is actually a poor conductor of heat, which in a hot climate is exactly the property you want. Thick mud brick walls don't block heat, exactly. They absorb it slowly through the day, storing it deep in the material, and then release that stored heat back out at night, long after the residents have gone up to the cooler rooftop to sleep. It's a property engineers now call thermal mass, and it's genuinely counterintuitive. The wall isn't stopping the heat, it's delaying it, buying the household an entire day's worth of cool interior air before the outside temperature finally, slowly catches up, by which point night has already arrived and the desert itself has cooled off to match. A 2026 engineering study modeling similar ancient mud brick structures in the region found that wall thickness produced a dramatic, non-linear improvement in interior comfort. Thicker walls didn't just help a little, they fundamentally changed how much heat made it inside at all. Which raises the next obvious question. If mud brick alone bought you a cooler house, what did the Egyptians build on top of that advantage? Here's what nobody tells you about ancient Egyptian houses. They weren't just passively resisting the heat. Some of them were actively hunting for cool air and dragging it inside. Egyptian builders developed a structure called the malqaf, a tall, narrow shaft rising above the roofline, deliberately angled to face the direction of the prevailing wind, usually from the north. As wind hit the opening, the shaft caught it and funneled it downward into the house below, creating a constant, engineered breeze in rooms that had no other reason to be anything but stagnant and stifling. Combine that incoming air current with strategically placed exit vents elsewhere in the house, and you get real air circulation. Hot air pushed out one side is cooler, moving air is pulled in the other. Accomplished with zero moving parts and zero energy input beyond the wind that was already blowing. Here's the wild part. This wasn't a lucky one-off invention that Egypt kept to itself. The malqaf's principle, catch wind above the roofline, funnel it down, vent hot air elsewhere, reappears independently and repeatedly across the ancient hot, dry world. Persian architecture developed its own version, the badger, or wind catcher, refining the same physics with taller towers and multiple internal channels. Centuries later, 20th century Egyptian architect Hassan Fathi revived these exact principles, almost brick for brick, when he designed the village of Nugorna in the 1940s using traditional Nubian mud brick construction and passive ventilation instead of imported concrete and mechanical cooling. Fathi's argument, decades before sustainable architecture was a phrase anyone used, was blunt. The ancient solutions weren't primitive stand-ins for real engineering. They were the real engineering, and modern buildings had simply forgotten how to read the wind. Now go back inside that same mud brick house and look up. The walls aren't left as raw, dark mud. They're coated in a thick layer of white gypsum plaster. That's not decoration, or not only decoration. White surfaces reflect far more solar radiation than dark ones, bouncing sunlight back off the exterior before it ever gets the chance to convert into stored heat in the first place. Layer that white plaster over already thick, slow-absorbing mud brick, add a wind-catching malqaf on the roof to keep air moving, and small, high, shaded windows to limit direct sun exposure while still allowing airflow. And you've built, without a single machine, a structure that does almost everything a modern air conditioner does: block incoming heat, delay what does get in, and actively move air. Different tools, same job. But the house was only ever the second half of the problem. Egyptians still had to leave it. They had to farm, build, transport stone, hunt, worship, and walk between one place and another under direct sun. Which brings us to the body itself. Not the sweat glands this time, but what Egyptians chose to put on top of them. Here's where another popular myth needs debunking. People assume desert peoples historically wore heavy, covering robes purely out of modesty or tradition, with comfort as an afterthought. In Egypt's case, that gets the causation backward. Egyptian clothing was built almost exclusively from linen, woven from the flax plant that grew abundantly along the Nile's fertile floodplain, the same annual flood doing double duty that fed both the fields and the wardrobe. Linen fibers are naturally more breathable and more efficient at wicking moisture than most other natural fabrics, pulling sweat away from the skin and out toward the surface of the garment, where, here's the loop, closing again. That same dry desert air could evaporate it quickly. Loose-fitting linen kilts, dresses, and robes did something almost paradoxical. They trapped a thin layer of air directly against the skin, shaded from the sun, which acted as insulation against external heat while still letting sweat-driven evaporative cooling do its work underneath. Light-colored, loose, breathable fabric wasn't a fashion choice, bolted onto a purely religious or class-based clothing culture. It was thermal engineering worn on the body, running in parallel with the thermal engineering built into the walls. And then there's the detail that sounds, on first hearing, like pure vanity. The thick black eyeliner painted around the eyes of nearly every Egyptian and every surviving piece of art, from farmers to pharaohs to the gods themselves. For most of modern history, this got filed under ancient beauty standard and left there. Here's the twist. It wasn't just beauty. It was medicine, and it was sun protection, operating through a mechanism nobody could have possibly understood at the time. The substance is called Kohl, traditionally ground from galena, a lead-based mineral, then mixed with other ingredients and applied heavily around the eyes. In 2009 and 2010, French chemists Philippe Walter and Christian Amator, the latter a pioneer of microelectrode techniques for studying biology at the cellular level, analyzed dozens of surviving samples of ancient Egyptian coal and made a discovery that startled even them. When the lead-based compounds in coal came into contact with the moisture of the eye, they triggered cells to release nitric oxide, a signaling molecule that activates the immune system's bacteria-fighting macrophage cells and widens blood vessels to accelerate the immune response. Their measurements showed something close to a 240-fold spike in nitric oxide production, an almost absurd biochemical overreaction for something applied as makeup. In practical terms, coal was quietly functioning as an antibacterial ointment, dramatically reducing eye infections in a country where windblown sand, dust, and the annual flooding of the Nile made eye disease a genuine, life-altering threat. On top of that immune effect, the sheer amount of dark pigment applied around the eyes cut down on glare, reducing the intensity of reflected desert sunlight hitting the eyes, functioning, in effect, as a crude but real predecessor to sunglasses, worn daily by people who had absolutely no concept of ultraviolet radiation or bacteria. They didn't need the concept. They only needed to notice, generation after generation, that the people who wore it suffered fewer eye problems than the people who didn't, and that observation, quietly passed down without a shred of modern science behind it, turned out to be correct. Here's the twist behind the twist. None of this, not the coal, not the linen, not the sweat glands, meant much if you were simply outside at the wrong hour. Which brings the story to the daily rhythm of Egyptian life itself. the layer that's easiest to overlook precisely because it looks like doing nothing. During the punishing peak of midday heat, historical accounts describe Egyptian daily life shifting almost entirely indoors, with activity pausing through the hottest hours and resuming again as the sun lost its edge. Public life, socializing, and even shopping shifting toward the cooler evening and night hours instead. It's the same instinct behind the modern siesta traditions still practiced across the Mediterranean and North Africa today, and it wasn't laziness or superstition. It was a schedule engineered, whether consciously or through generations of trial and error, around exactly the hours the human sweat cooling system starts to lose the fight against incoming solar radiation. Combine that timing shift with rooftop sleeping, moving up and out of the heat-retaining mud brick interior at night onto a rooftop that had already released its stored daytime heat back into the cooling night air. And you get a full 24-hour cycle where the built environment and the human schedule were working the same problem from two different directions at once. Here's another layer that rarely makes the popular version of this story at all: salt. Sweating 2 to 4 liters a day in extreme heat doesn't just cost you water, it costs you electrolytes, sodium chief among them, and severe sodium loss produces cramping, disorientation, and eventually collapse, regardless of how much plain water you drink to replace the fluid. Egypt, conveniently, sat near significant natural salt deposits, and salt threaded through Egyptian diet, trade, and even mummification practice via natron, a naturally occurring salt compound used to dry and preserve bodies. The same mineral that helped desiccate a corpse for the afterlife was, in the living, quietly replacing what the desert pulled out of them every single day. It's not a coincidence that a civilization built entirely around managing water loss also became remarkably sophisticated in managing salt. Let's widen the lens for a moment and trace how far this specific idea, capture the wind, don't fight the sun, work with the body's own chemistry instead of against it, actually traveled through history because the ripple effect is bigger than Egypt alone. The windcatcher principle, born in mud brick Nile Valley homes, echoes forward into Persian Badgir's cooling desert cities like Yazd centuries later, and into the mashrabia lattice screens of medieval Islamic architecture, which filtered both light and airflow through elaborately carved wooden screens. Salt-based food preservation, the same underlying chemistry as natron, spread and reappeared as a strategic resource across entirely unrelated civilizations. Roman soldiers were partly paid in salt, which is where the word salary comes from. Timbuktu grew wealthy as a hub of the trans-Saharan salt trade. French kings taxed salt so aggressively through the gabelle that the tax itself helped fuel revolutionary anger centuries later, and Gandhi, in 1930, marched 240 miles to the sea for the sole purpose of illegally making his own salt, turning the same mineral that once quietly kept Nile Valley farmers alive into a direct act of political defiance against an empire. And the passive cooling architecture itself didn't stay buried in antiquity either. It resurfaced explicitly in Hassan Fathi's 20th century designs, and it's resurfacing again right now as contemporary architects and engineers, facing a warming planet and unsustainable air conditioning demand, run detailed thermal simulations on ancient mud brick structures to extract design principles for modern low-energy buildings. The exact same physics an unnamed Egyptian brickmaker understood through instinct and repetition 4,000 years ago is now being modeled in software by climate engineers trying to solve the same problem she solved for entirely modern reasons. There's one more vignette worth sitting inside before zooming all the way out, because it captures something the mechanical explanations alone can't. Imagine a household on the western edge of Thebes, the hottest stretch of a summer afternoon, the kind where even the shaded mud brick interior has gone warm and heavy. A father sits cross-legged on a woven reed mat in the central hall of the house, the tallest room, its high ceiling and small upper windows, letting the day's accumulated hot air rise and slip out above him, while cooler air stays pooled near the floor where the family sits. Beside him, a large, porous clay jar sweats faintly on its outer surface, water seeping through microscopic pores in the unglazed clay, evaporating on contact with the dry air, quietly chilling the water still inside by several degrees. A trick of simple materials. Science nobody in the house could have explained, but every one of them relied on daily. His youngest daughter presses her palm flat against the jar's damp, cool surface and holds it there, then transfers that same cool hand to the back of her own neck, laughing at the small relief of it. Outside the thick walls, the street is nearly silent. Shops shuttered, animals resting in shade, the whole town operating on an unspoken agreement to simply wait the sun out. It is, by any modern measure, an unbearable afternoon. Inside those walls, on that mat, next to that sweating jar, it is merely warm. So here's where all the individual pieces finally connect into one system instead of a list of separate tricks. 2 to 4 million sweat glands, a genetic gift no other primate carries at the same density, only work as designed in dry air. And Egypt happened to sit inside exactly that kind of climate. The Nile supplied the water that sweating constantly demands on a flood cycle precise enough to build an entire calendar and society around. Mud brick walls, thick and white plastered, turned that water-poor but sun-rich environment into slow-absorbing, heat-delaying shelter. Malqaf wind catchers actively pulled moving air down into that shelter instead of passively waiting for relief. Linen clothing extended the same evaporative cooling logic from the walls onto the skin itself. Kohl, without anyone understanding a single word of immunology, cut down both glare and infection at the one part of the body left exposed. Salt replaced what sweat carried away before the deficit could turn dangerous. And the daily and seasonal rhythm of Egyptian life. Resting at peak heat, sleeping on cool rooftops, timing agriculture to the flood, synchronized all of it into a single, continuous, self-reinforcing system. Remove any one piece and the rest strains. Remove several and it collapses. The way Moeller and Manning's research shows it very nearly did during the Old Kingdom's worst climate stress, when the Nile's flood pattern weakened for extended stretches and even mighty Egypt came close to unraveling. Zoom all the way out to right now, today, and the uncomfortable part of this story is how little separates you from that Theban household. Your body still runs on the exact same 2 to 4 million sweat glands, the exact same engrailed 1 genetic switch, the exact same reliance on dry air to make evaporation actually work. Global average temperatures are climbing, and heat-related illness and death are rising with them, in a world that has largely convinced itself the answer is simply more mechanical air conditioning, more energy consumption solving, a problem partly caused by energy consumption in the first place. And so, quietly, architects and engineers have started looking backward instead of only forward. Hassan Fathi's mid-century revival of ancient passive cooling, contemporary thermal mass studies modeling ancient mud brick walls and software, renewed interest in wind catcher design for buildings that need to stay cool without a single kilowatt of mechanical help. The wisdom didn't disappear. It got buried under a century of cheap electricity, and now it's being carefully, deliberately dug back out, not as a nostalgic gesture, but because the underlying physics never stopped being true. Thick walls still delay heat. White surfaces still reflect it. Moving air still cools skin. 4,000 years changed almost nothing about the actual problem. It only changed how confidently we forgot the solution. So go back to that wall of heat you stepped into at the very start of this. Feel it again, honestly, for a second. The solid weight of it. The way your skin reacts before your brain even catches up. Now understand that an ancient Egyptian farmer, standing in air this hot or hotter thousands of years before your birth, with none of your modern tools, had already quietly solved you. The sweat on your neck right now, the instinct to seek shade, the plain fact that you're still alive to read this at all. Every piece of that traces back through an unbroken chain of trial, error, and stubborn cleverness that started on the banks of a single river in the middle of a desert that should, by every reasonable measure, have killed everyone who ever tried to live there. It didn't. And the wall of heat you just imagined stepping into, that's not a threat anymore, that's an inheritance.